Donald Trump sat in the quiet, just off stage, staring at the floor without blinking. The polished tile beneath his shoes reflected more light than the room deserved, and even though the room was not small, it felt like it was shrinking. His arms rested on his thighs, and his hands hung loose, but not relaxed. There was something in the way his fingers hovered, as if they expected to be called to action. His tie was knotted perfectly, his jacket pressed sharp, but none of that helped him feel settled. When the stage manager called out his name, it did not sound like an invitation. It sounded like a test. Donald Trump stood without needing help, but the motion lacked its usual confidence. As he stepped onto the soundstage, no applause greeted him. No music played. The lights above him were warm, but not kind. The audience watched in full silence, unsure whether to perform civility or hold their breath. No one moved first. Jimmy Kimmel remained seated at his desk. He did not smile. He did not extend a hand. He simply waited, and the waiting stretched long enough that it began to feel like part of the show. When Donald Trump reached his chair, he sat without being asked. He faced Jimmy directly, though his eyes flickered toward the studio audience, as if searching for signs of loyalty or ambush. Jimmy folded his hands together and set them on the desk. "Thank you for coming," Jimmy said. Donald Trump nodded once. "You talk about me enough. I figured it was time you said it to my face." Jimmy let the moment hang. "I do talk about you. A lot of people do. That's what happens when you've been president. And that's what happens when you're running again." Donald Trump sat very still. "You call it talking. I call it lying." Jimmy's voice did not change. "You've said a lot of things about the press. About people like me. About the truth. So I want to be clear from the beginning. I'm not here to trap you. But I'm not here to protect you either." Donald Trump nodded again, slower this time. "You never have." There was a pause, not for effect, but because both men knew how many people were watching and how many people were waiting to be told what they already believed. Jimmy glanced down at the cards in front of him, but he did not pick them up. "I want to ask you something that has nothing to do with polling or politics," Jimmy said. "I want to ask you if you ever feel regret." Donald Trump did not answer right away. He looked toward the floor, then toward the lights, then back at Jimmy. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than expected. "About what?" Jimmy leaned forward just slightly. "About January 6th. About what happened in that building. About the fear on people's faces. About the violence. About the fact that your name was chanted by people breaking glass and carrying weapons." Donald Trump's mouth stayed closed, but something behind his eyes changed. It was not recognition. It was resistance. His voice hardened as he spoke. "I told people to protest peacefully. I told them to respect the law. What happened after that wasn't mine to control." Jimmy's tone remained even. "You were watching it happen. You were the one they said they were following. People asked you to stop it, and you waited hours before you said anything. And when you did, you told them you loved them." Donald Trump's lips tightened. "You say it like they were all criminals. But they were angry Americans. They didn't trust the election. They didn't trust the system. That didn't come from nowhere." Jimmy's response was measured. Anger doesn't excuse violence. Mistrust doesn't excuse breaking down the doors of democracy. And love, real love, doesn't look like silence while people bleed. Donald Trump shifted in his chair. "You want to make me the villain because it's easier than asking why they were there in the first place. Maybe the real problem is the people in power who stopped listening to them." Jimmy shook his head once. "The problem is power without accountability. And you're sitting here because no one ever made you answer for anything. Until now." Donald Trump did not respond. He sat back, but he did not look comfortable. The silence that followed was not dramatic. It was honest. It felt like something had been taken out of the room and not returned. Jimmy looked at the audience only once, and then he looked directly at Donald Trump again. "I invited you here because I wanted to hear you say something real," Jimmy said. "Not for me, not for the headlines, but for the people who followed you when they needed someone to lead them. And instead, they got a man who watched it happen and said nothing when it mattered." Donald Trump's voice came out low and slow. "You think this makes you noble. You think sitting behind a desk and asking questions makes you better than the people who build this country. You think mocking me makes you a hero. But you're just another face behind a camera, reading lines someone else wrote." Jimmy let out a breath, not loud, not sharp, just enough to move the air between them. "I'm not a hero," he said, "but I'm not the one who told this country to remember the day it tried to break itself. And I'm not the one who's still pretending that nothing went wrong." Donald Trump stood up. No one asked him to. He did not look at the audience. He did not shake Jimmy's hand. He did not say goodbye. He walked off the stage slowly, with no music and no applause, just the sound of his own footsteps and the soft creak of his chair settling back into stillness behind him. The show did not go to commercial. The lights did not fade. Jimmy sat alone at his desk, looking straight ahead. His voice was quiet when he finally spoke. Some conversations don't need a punchline. Some endings speak for themselves. Then he folded his hands again, and the room stayed quiet for a long time. The next morning, nothing moved quickly. Inside the control room of the studio, the monitors still glowed with frozen frames from the night before. No one had touched them. A few empty coffee cups stood abandoned near the editing bay, and none of the producers spoke above a whisper. Something about the way the air lingered in that space made people feel like they were walking through the aftershock of something that had not finished collapsing. Outside the studio, things were moving faster. By sunrise, the confrontation had already become more than a clip. It had become a headline, then a debate, then a symbol. Some networks ran it on repeat, stripping the silence from it and filling the gaps with voices that did not understand what had really happened. Others ignored it completely, choosing instead to pretend that silence meant irrelevance. But for people who had watched it live, something about it stayed. Not because it had been loud, but because it had not needed to be. Jimmy Kimmel sat in his office with the door closed. He had not spoken to anyone that morning. His phone had buzzed all night with messages from friends, strangers, and colleagues who wanted to congratulate him, or challenge him, or ask him what it had felt like. But Jimmy had not responded to any of them. He sat alone with the lights off, watching the recording play again, this time without the sound. He watched Donald Trump walk on stage, watched himself stay seated, watched the conversation unfold like something being unwrapped slowly, only to reveal something sharp inside. He paused the recording on the moment when Donald Trump stood up. The image froze on a frame where both men were visible, not speaking, not moving, just facing away from one another. Jimmy stared at that still image for a long time before closing his laptop. He did not feel triumphant. He did not feel vindicated. He felt tired in a way that came from deeper than sleep. He had not wanted to humiliate anyone. He had not planned to argue. But something about watching power refuse to reflect and then leave without reflection had drained something in him that had not yet returned. Later that afternoon, when Jimmy finally walked out of the building, he kept his head low. The sun was bright and the air was warm, but it did not feel like spring. It felt like something more uncertain. He crossed the street without looking at the cameras that had gathered across from the studio doors. He heard his name once, but he did not turn. Elsewhere, in a high-rise office with tinted windows, Donald Trump sat in a leather chair facing the city. The lights were off in that room too, but the windows let in more than enough light. His jacket was still perfect, his shirt still white, but his shoulders were pulled tighter than usual. His phone rested on the table in front of him, screen down, even though it had been vibrating every 30 seconds for the past 2 hours. An aide had spoken to him briefly earlier that morning, reading headlines from different outlets and summarizing reactions. Donald Trump had listened without expression, then raised one hand gently and asked to be left alone. Since then, the room had been silent. He had not said much, but he had replayed the interview in his mind again and again, not for the content, but for the feeling. He did not regret what he had said. He did not regret standing up and walking off. But something about the way no one had stopped him stayed with him in a quiet, unsettling way. He was used to controlling the room. He was used to commanding energy. But in that studio, he had felt something he could not name. Not rejection, not defeat, something stranger, like indifference, like being told he was no longer feared. He picked up his phone and turned it over. The screen came to life, filled with missed calls, messages, and notifications. He ignored them all except one. It was a text from someone he had not spoken to in months. The message was short. "You used to listen. You don't anymore." He read it twice, then deleted it. But the words stayed with him longer than he expected. He sat back in the chair, and looked out at the skyline. The buildings below looked smaller than they used to. The city felt distant. And for the first time in a very long time, Donald Trump felt something in his chest that resembled stillness. That evening, Jimmy Kimmel opened the show without his usual jokes. He sat down at the desk and looked into the camera with the same expression he had worn the night before. There's a difference between disagreeing with someone and refusing to acknowledge what they've become, Jimmy said. I disagreed with a lot of people over the years. But this is different. Last night wasn't about left or right. It was about whether someone who once held the most powerful office in the world could answer a simple question with a human truth. He paused, but not for effect. He paused because the words were heavy and he needed to place them carefully. People deserve honesty. Not performance. Not spectacle. Just honesty. And sometimes, the loudest silence is the one that answers everything. He looked down for a moment, then back up. We'll be right back. The screen faded to black, but the feeling did not leave. In homes across the country, people sat with the quiet that followed. Some felt satisfaction. Others felt unease. But most felt something they could not quite name, something between recognition and discomfort. It was the feeling of watching a powerful man step into a room expecting to be feared and leaving with no one following. And for the first time in a long time, the story did not end with a headline. It ended with a question that would not go away. 3 days passed before Donald Trump made a statement. It did not come from a press conference. It did not come from an official account. It came from a video recorded in a hotel room with poor lighting and a handheld phone. The camera angle was slightly too low, and the sound carried a faint echo, as if the room had not been prepared for reflection. Donald Trump looked directly at the screen and spoke with a flatness that had not been there before. What you saw the other night was a setup, he said. It was a show. It wasn't real. They didn't want a conversation. They wanted a takedown. That's what late night has become. And that's why this country is angry. He did not mention Jimmy Kimmel by name. He did not repeat anything that had been said during the interview. He spoke in generalities, using phrases that sounded familiar but no longer landed with the same weight. He repeated that the media was dishonest. He repeated that people were waking up. But even his most loyal followers noticed something in the tone that felt unfamiliar. It was not surrender. It was not reflection. It was something harder to define. Something like distance. The video circulated quickly, but it did not dominate the news cycle. In previous years, it might have. In previous years, networks would have dissected every sentence. But now, the reaction came in shorter waves. There were statements of support. There were declarations of outrage. But there was also something else, spreading slowly and quietly across the edges of public conversation. It was a question people had been afraid to ask. What happens when a man who built himself on power no longer holds it the same way? Jimmy Kimmel did not respond to the video. He continued with his show, returning to his usual rhythm of jokes and interviews. But those closest to him noticed a change. He smiled less between segments. He stayed longer in his office after tapings. He asked fewer questions during rehearsal and read more quietly from the cards before filming began. When asked by a friend whether he felt proud of what had happened, Jimmy paused before answering. I didn't want it to go that way, he said. I didn't want him to walk out. I just wanted something real. And I think, for a second, I almost got it. Then it slipped. The friend asked if he would do it again. Jimmy nodded. Yes, but not because I enjoyed it. Because I couldn't not. Meanwhile, Donald Trump retreated into familiar territory. He resumed interviews with friendly outlets. He appeared at rallies where the crowd still cheered and the music still played. But something about the way he moved on those stages had shifted. He spoke louder, but with less variation. He repeated old lines that once stirred the crowd, but now they fell flatter, as if the echo of the studio had followed him out into the open air. People around him noticed. His campaign advisors adjusted talking points. His aides reshuffled travel schedules. But none of that addressed the deeper change. It was not about strategy. It was about something that could not be repaired with optics. It was about the moment a man realized that attention could no longer protect him from truth. Inside his private residence, late one night, Donald Trump sat alone and watched the full interview again. Not the headlines. Not the edited clips. The full, unbroken version. He watched himself walk onto the stage. He watched the exchange unfold with no interruptions. He watched himself stand and leave. When the screen finally went dark, he did not move for several minutes. Then he spoke, but only to the empty room. They didn't understand what I was trying to say. No one answered. No one corrected him. But the silence did not comfort him the way it used to. Elsewhere, in a small house in Pennsylvania, a retired schoolteacher named Linda Novak sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold. She had voted for Donald Trump once. She had defended him to friends. She had believed in what he promised. But she had also watched the interview that night. She had not planned to. She had stumbled upon it while flipping through channels, not expecting to feel anything. But as the conversation unfolded, she found herself sitting up straighter in her chair. When it ended, she did not feel anger. She did not feel betrayed. She felt tired in a way she had not admitted to anyone. It was not the kind of tired that came from work or age. It was the kind that came from carrying belief for too long without asking whether it still fit. She picked up her phone and opened a message thread with her daughter. The two of them had not spoken about politics in over a year. Too many arguments. Too many silences. But now she typed slowly, with care. I saw him on TV. I don't know how to explain it. But something felt different. Maybe I was wrong. She did not send the message right away. She read it twice. Then she pressed send and waited. In living rooms and kitchens and cars across the country, people like Linda were having small, quiet reckonings. Not loud conversions. Not grand reversals. Just questions they had not let themselves ask until now. Questions that lived in stillness. Questions that could not be shouted down. The interview had ended in silence. But the silence had begun to speak. Donald Trump returned to Michigan 2 weeks later. The event was smaller than his campaign had predicted. Rows of folding chairs lined a gravel lot outside a steel supply warehouse that had once held 400 jobs. Now it held 23. The man who owned the business stood near the makeshift stage, checking his watch between conversations with reporters. He had supported the tariffs when they were first announced. He had even stood beside Donald Trump in a photo once, smiling in front of a wall of coiled sheet metal. That photo still hung in his office, but it no longer meant the same thing. Donald Trump took the stage under a gray sky that threatened rain, but never followed through. He wore a red tie and a dark coat. His hair looked exactly as it always had, and so did his opening line. He said the country was broken. He said it could only be fixed by someone strong. He said tariffs had saved American industry. But the men in the front row did not cheer as quickly as they used to. Some of them had sons who had been laid off after the tariffs made it harder to sell their parts overseas. Some of them had quietly picked up night shifts at logistics companies to cover the gaps in their paychecks. And all of them had heard him speak those same lines before, with more conviction than he carried now. From the stage, Donald Trump noticed the change in energy. He adjusted his tone and pointed to the warehouse behind him. This place, he said, is the reason we fight for tariffs. It's the reason we bring manufacturing back. It's proof that when America puts its workers first, the whole world notices. A man near the back crossed his arms and looked down. He had worked in that warehouse for 17 years before being told his job was being automated. He had not been angry then. He had understood business moved forward. But when the layoffs were followed by speeches about saving American jobs, something inside him had gone quiet. He listened now, but he did not cheer. Donald Trump raised his voice and repeated his promise to make America unbeatable in trade. He listed numbers, percentages, and countries. He used the word winning 5 times in one paragraph. But the crowd did not move. Not in anger. Not in celebration. They stood in a strange middle ground between memory and uncertainty. They remembered how it used to feel, but they were no longer sure it still belonged to them. After the speech, Donald Trump stepped off the stage and walked to the side with his advisors. He asked one of them how the coverage was tracking. The advisor answered carefully. The national outlets were focused on the turnout. The local papers had mentioned the empty factory floor in their opening paragraphs. Donald Trump nodded once, but said nothing. He looked back at the warehouse and studied the rust on the edge of the metal awning near the roofline. Then he got in the car and closed the door before anyone else could speak. That night, Linda Novak watched the coverage from her living room. The footage showed Donald Trump smiling and waving. The voiceover mentioned tariffs, trade wars, and strong economic leadership. But the camera caught something else too. It caught the face of a man in the crowd staring at the stage without expression, his hands in his pockets and his shoulders slightly hunched. Linda noticed the look in his eyes. It was the same look she had seen in the mirror a week earlier after watching the Kimmel interview. Not disappointment, not anger, something quieter, something like recognition. She reached for her notebook and wrote a single sentence. Strong doesn't always mean right. She didn't know yet what she would do with those words. But they felt like the beginning of something. In a quiet apartment in Arizona, Jimmy Kimmel sat on his couch with a glass of water and a stack of notes. He had a new show taping in the morning, a new monologue, a new cycle of news. But he could not stop thinking about the phrase Donald Trump had repeated during the rally. "We're bringing the jobs back." Jimmy said it aloud once, just to hear how it sounded in his own voice. Then he closed his notebook and turned off the light. The sentence stayed in his mind, echoing without answers. Because what no one had said, not on stage, not in interviews, not in campaign ads or sound bites, was what happened when the jobs did not come back. What happened when the numbers stopped matching the stories? What happened when a man who had once promised to protect the forgotten began to be forgotten himself? Some shifts are loud, but others arrive slowly, like a silence that spreads across a crowd before anyone realizes it has settled in. And in that silence, the truth waits. In the days that followed, people stopped talking about the interview the way they had before. The outrage softened. The headlines moved on. But the feeling it had stirred did not disappear. It simply moved deeper, like heat that had settled into the walls of a house long after the fire had gone out. Donald Trump resumed his schedule. He traveled to Iowa, then to Ohio. Each event followed the same pattern. A crowd, a promise, a declaration of strength. He spoke about tariffs with the same certainty he had used years ago, but the applause no longer arrived on cue. The faces in the audience still nodded. They still wore the colors and held the signs. But the eyes had changed. The energy had become something different. Less electric, more cautious. At one event outside Toledo, a small group of farmers stood near the back of the crowd. They listened quietly as Donald Trump listed countries and trade deals, as he said that tariffs were how America showed the world it meant business. One of the farmers, a man named Robert Klein, looked down at his hands during most of the speech. His thumbs were stained from tractor grease. His wrist carried a fading tan line from a watch he no longer wore. The past 3 years had been harder than he'd expected. The price of feed had risen. The cost of equipment had doubled. And some of his biggest buyers overseas had stopped returning calls. He still wanted to believe in the message. He still respected strength. But when Donald Trump said that tariffs were helping farmers win again, Robert felt something inside him tighten. He had never thought of himself as someone who needed help. But he had never thought of himself as someone who could be ignored either. After the speech, Robert walked back to his truck without saying anything. His son, who had come along for the event, finally asked what he thought. Robert did not answer right away. He opened the door, climbed into the driver's seat, and stared through the windshield. "He doesn't know what it costs us," Robert finally said. "He only knows what it cost him to say it." They drove home in silence. Elsewhere, in a hotel room overlooking the Hudson River, Donald Trump sat with a campaign advisor who was trying to explain the data. Voter enthusiasm had plateaued in several key states. Rural attendance was shrinking by small, measurable percentages. Urban hostility was unchanged. The advisor used the word fatigue. Donald Trump interrupted him. "They said that last time." The advisor nodded. "They did. But this isn't last time." Donald Trump stood and walked to the window. He stared out at the city, not because he wanted to see it, but because he wanted to be seen by it. He had always believed that power could be restored by returning to the places where it once lived. But the skyline no longer gave him the feeling it used to. It still stood tall, but it did not turn when he walked past. He turned back to the advisor. "They're wrong. The people still believe in strength." The advisor closed his notebook without arguing. It was not his job to question belief. It was only his job to measure it. That evening, Jimmy Kimmel received a letter in a plain white envelope with no return address. Inside was a folded piece of paper and nothing else. The handwriting was uneven, like it had been written by someone whose hands no longer moved as steadily as they once did. It said only this: I supported him. I defended him. I told my kids he was fighting for us. But I watched that interview 3 times. I kept waiting for him to say something real. He never did. I'm tired of waiting. Jimmy read the letter twice, then folded it again and placed it on his desk. He did not read it on the air. He did not mention it in his next monologue. He kept it beside his notes, and every time he sat down to write, he saw it in the corner of his vision. He thought about what it meant that someone had taken the time to write that letter by hand, that they had not signed it, that they had written the words as if speaking them aloud would have made them too real. In Pennsylvania, Linda Novak took a walk through her neighborhood and noticed something that made her stop. It was a flagpole. It had always been there. But the flag that once carried a campaign slogan was gone. The pole stood bare now, its rope tied neatly at the bottom, as if waiting for something else. She stood for a moment and watched it. Then she continued walking, not with certainty, but with steadier steps than she had taken in a long time. Tariffs had once been an idea that promised pride. They had once meant sovereignty, toughness, independence. But now, in the quiet corners of the country, they meant something else too. They meant cost. They meant distance. They meant being asked to celebrate sacrifice long after the reward stopped arriving. The voices that once shouted about them had grown quieter. And in their place, new voices were beginning to whisper questions they had never dared speak aloud. A week after the rally in Toledo, Donald Trump sat in a conference room with 6 donors and 3 aides. The table was long and bare, except for 2 crystal water pitchers and a tablet that no one touched. The donors asked questions about strategy. They wanted to know about polling, fundraising, and the debate schedule. Donald Trump answered each one with confidence, sometimes repeating phrases word for word from older campaigns. He said the movement was stronger than ever. He said tariffs were still one of the smartest decisions ever made by any American president. He said the economy had been perfect until it was sabotaged. But beneath the table, his fingers moved across each other with a rhythm that did not match his voice. One of the donors, a retired shipping executive from Illinois, leaned forward slightly. My warehouses are full, the man said. China didn't fold. They found other buyers. We lost contracts. What's the plan to bring those back? Donald Trump smiled, but only with his mouth. They'll come back when we finish what we started. The donor nodded, but his eyes lowered. He did not ask another question. Across the country, in a town outside Spokane, a woman named Carrie Holloway loaded groceries into the back of her car. She had voted for Donald Trump twice. Her husband had lost a job in steel, but found a new one in construction. They had managed. They had believed in the message. They had told their kids that sacrifice was part of leadership. But that morning, Carrie had opened their insurance renewal letter and found a number she could not afford. At the checkout line, she had watched prices climb past her budget. When the cashier gave her the total, Carrie had removed 3 items from the cart without saying a word. One was a small bag of coffee she had planned to gift her neighbor. One was a toy for her youngest son's birthday. One was a box of pasta she had grabbed without thinking. Each item was small, but as she placed them back on the counter, she felt something inside her shift. In the parking lot, she stood beside her car longer than she needed to. She stared out at the flat line of the highway beyond the grocery store and tried to remember the last time she had felt certain that things were moving forward. Not in the world, not in headlines, but in her own life. She thought about tariffs. She thought about the speeches. She thought about the word strength and how often it had been said into microphones while people like her learned to live with less. Later that night, Carrie posted on a small online forum she rarely used. I believed in what he said about power, but I've started to notice that power doesn't always lift the people holding it up. No one replied at first. Then a woman from Indiana responded with 3 words. You're not alone. That reply got 17 likes in 20 minutes. Back in New York, Jimmy Kimmel walked through Central Park with his wife. They did not speak about politics. They spoke about the birds nesting along the path, about their daughter's upcoming recital, about the weather. But at one point, she asked him something that made him stop walking. Do you think he ever tells the truth to himself? Jimmy looked ahead at the row of benches. Most of them were empty. He thought for a long moment before answering. I think he believes whatever he needs to believe in the moment. I don't think it starts as a lie. I think it becomes one later, when no one stops him. His wife nodded. They walked in silence for another block. Back inside his apartment, Donald Trump stood at the window and looked out over the skyline again. It was a clear night, and the lights below sparkled like they always had. But the more he looked, the more he realized he could not name any of the buildings anymore. So many new towers had been built. So many new names had risen. He reached for the television remote and flipped through channels. Every third story still mentioned him, but fewer stayed focused. The segments ended sooner. The tone had changed, not in opposition, but in distance, like watching someone fall out of orbit. He turned the television off and stood still for a long time. In the quiet, he thought again of the stage. He thought again of the studio. He thought again of Jimmy Kimmel's voice, not because of what was said, but because of the way it had not flinched. For the first time in weeks, he considered the idea that walking out had not looked like strength. It had looked like retreat. But the thought passed quickly. He replaced it with a sentence he had said 100 times before. They still need me. He did not say it aloud. He only thought it. And for the first time, the silence did not agree. Donald Trump flew to Florida the following weekend. The rally was scheduled near the edge of a suburb that had once been solidly Republican, but now shifted with each new election cycle. The venue was an open lot beside a former shopping plaza, with a temporary stage and 2 rows of flagpoles brought in that morning. The chairs filled slower than expected. The sun was sharp, and the air carried the heavy stillness of early heat. People fanned themselves with signs that said, "Bring back strength," but many held them lower than before. On stage, Donald Trump began with familiar lines. He talked about winning. He talked about tariffs. He said America had been stolen, then broken, then forgotten. He said he had fixed it once and would fix it again. But in the middle of his speech, something shifted. It was not a stumble. It was not a mistake. It was a single sentence, spoken differently. They laughed when I brought tariffs back, he said. They said it would hurt farmers and small businesses. Maybe it did for a while. But what was the alternative? Weakness. He moved on quickly. The crowd did not react. But a man in the 4th row narrowed his eyes. He was a mechanic from Ocala, and his brother had lost his job at a citrus packaging plant after export demand collapsed. The plant had closed 18 months after the tariffs took effect. It was never mentioned on the news. No one from the campaign had visited. The man looked at the flag beside the stage, then back at Donald Trump, and for the first time since 2016, he stopped clapping before the speech ended. In a retirement home 2 hours away, a former trade consultant named Walter Griggs watched the rally on television. He had worked under multiple administrations. He had supported the idea of strong domestic production. But as he watched Donald Trump speak, he did not feel affirmation. He felt distance, like watching someone build a wall out of old words, then forget which side of it he stood on. He turned the volume down and sat in the quiet. He never adapted, Walter said to no one. He just repeated. In Los Angeles, Jimmy Kimmel received another letter. This one came from a high school senior in Kansas. The handwriting was clean. The tone was careful. My dad believes in him. He always has. I used to argue with him. Now I just listen. After your interview, he didn't say anything for a long time. That night, he turned off the TV and sat at the kitchen table by himself. I don't think he's changed his mind, but I think something changed in his heart. I'm not sure what to do with that, but I wanted you to know. Jimmy held the letter longer than the others. He placed it beside the unsigned one from before. They did not feel like trophies. They felt like evidence of something still unfolding. That night, Donald Trump sat alone in his Mar-a-Lago office. The room was perfectly lit, but the light no longer softened him the way it once had. He sat behind the desk without papers, without notes, just the weight of his own thoughts. For hours, he did not speak. He watched the shadows on the walls stretch and shift. Eventually, he stood and walked to the mirror. He looked into it and studied the face he had spent decades mastering. The lines were deeper now, the eyes still sharp, but less certain. He adjusted his collar, then reached for a comb he no longer needed. He did not rehearse anything aloud. He did not smile at the reflection. He just stood there, measuring the man he had become against the silence that now met him where applause used to be. In a house in Ohio, Linda Novak marked a page in a novel she had started reading. She had never cared much for politics before Donald Trump, but his voice had pulled her in once. It had promised clarity, purpose, a kind of armor against the noise of modern life. Now, as she closed the book and turned off the light, she thought about that armor and how heavy it had become, not just for him, but for everyone who had once believed it would protect them. The following Monday, a brief clip from the Kimmel interview resurfaced online. It had been shared before, thousands of times, but this version was trimmed differently. It started just after Jimmy Kimmel asked whether Donald Trump felt regret. It cut out the argument. It cut out the confrontation. It ended before Donald Trump stood to leave. All it captured was the moment of silence that passed between the question and the answer. There was no voiceover, no music, just two men on a stage in stillness. It spread slowly, not viral, not explosive, but steadily, like something that traveled not through emotion, but through recognition. People did not share it with captions. They shared it with a sentence, always quiet, always personal. This made me stop. I've watched this 3 times. I don't know what I feel, but I feel something. In the Midwest, a man named Elijah worked the night shift at a packaging plant that had cut half its staff since the tariffs began. He had been a Trump supporter from the beginning. He liked that someone had finally spoken with certainty. He liked that someone had looked into a camera and said things others were too afraid to say. But he had also watched 3 friends lose their jobs. He had watched his manager leave the state. He had watched his father start taking part-time work again, even after retirement. That night, Elijah sat in the break room, staring at his phone. He watched the clip again. Just the silence. Just the pause. He thought about how hard it must be to be asked about regret and not have a ready answer. He thought about how hard it was to carry regret alone. He set the phone down and walked back to the line, slower than usual. In Georgia, a young mother named Renee stood at her kitchen sink, washing dishes while her toddler played on the floor nearby. She had turned the television off earlier, unable to watch another ad about tariffs or border control or American steel. She was tired of slogans, tired of promises that felt like they belonged to someone else. Her grocery bill had climbed 30%. Her husband's construction company was bidding on smaller jobs. They were managing, but the room had grown tighter around them. Later that night, she opened her laptop and watched the clip of the interview. She watched the silence again. She remembered her father's voice, years ago, when he had sat at their kitchen table and said, without raising it, "This country needs a man who doesn't blink." Now, watching the screen, she wondered if blinking wasn't the point. Maybe it was the failure to blink, the failure to stop, that made people dangerous, that made power into something hollow. She did not tell her father how she felt. Not yet. But she did not look away. At Mar-a-Lago, Donald Trump did not know the clip was circulating. His staff filtered what reached him. They controlled the headlines. They filtered analytics. They replayed the rallies where the cheers still came. They handed him folders with talking points that still used the word strong. But a junior aide who had watched the clip on her own phone stood near the edge of the room during a briefing. She watched Donald Trump as he repeated a sentence he had said 3 times that week. "We're still the only ones telling the truth." She felt something shift in her chest. Not anger, not doubt, just distance. And in that space, for the first time, she felt alone in the room with him. Later, she would delete the clip from her phone, not out of guilt, but because she could not explain to herself why it made her feel so quiet. Back in Los Angeles, Jimmy Kimmel walked into the studio for rehearsal. He said nothing to the crew about the clip. He made no jokes about the silence. He returned to his cards and read through the monologue he had written for that evening. It was lighter, less pointed, but in the margins of the page, he had written a sentence and circled it. Not all noise is sound. He wasn't sure yet if he would say it aloud, but he knew why he had written it. Because in that moment, and in the slow echo that followed, something real had been revealed. Not in what was shouted, but in what had been withheld. And people had noticed, even if they never said it out loud. 1 month after the interview, a journalist published a long feature on the moment Donald Trump walked off the Kimmel stage. It was not a hit piece. It was not a celebration. It was quiet, methodical, and filled with quotes from people who had once built their lives around his promises. Farmers, warehouse workers, small business owners. A retired steelworker in Ohio said the interview reminded him of watching someone leave a factory line without finishing the job. A single mother in Arizona said she used to turn up the volume when Trump was on television, but now she muted the sound just to see if the look in his eyes still matched the words. The article ended with a quote from a man in Wisconsin who had campaigned door to door in 2016. "He gave us the feeling of being seen," the man said. "But I don't think he sees us anymore. I think he's only watching himself." The article didn't trend. It didn't go viral. But it found its way into quiet corners, forums, inboxes, folded newspapers on kitchen counters. People read it. Then they folded it again and didn't speak of it out loud. In Washington, one of Donald Trump's senior advisors brought the article into a meeting. He didn't say much. He just placed it on the table. Donald Trump glanced at the headline, then looked away. "I don't care what they print," he said. "We've been here before. This is nothing new." But the advisor said nothing, and the article stayed on the table until the meeting ended. That night, Donald Trump called a trusted ally from his early campaign days. The conversation was brief. He asked about media noise, about the polling in Florida, about whether he should revisit Michigan. But before he hung up, he asked one more thing. "Do you think people still feel me the way they used to?" There was a pause. "I think they want to," the voice said. "I think they're waiting for you to give them something that isn't just about being right." Donald Trump did not answer. He ended the call. In a diner outside Pittsburgh, Linda Novak met her daughter for lunch. It had been months since they had spoken without tension. They had both avoided the topic that had driven them apart, but now the silence between them had softened. Halfway through their meal, her daughter placed her phone on the table, face down, and spoke carefully. "I saw that clip again. The one where he didn't answer." Linda nodded. "I saw it too." Her daughter looked up. "What did you feel when you watched it?" Linda stirred her coffee before answering. "I felt like I was watching someone try to find the truth in a room that wasn't built for it." Her daughter said nothing, but her shoulders eased. Later that day, Jimmy Kimmel stood backstage before taping. He looked at the crowd through a narrow opening in the curtain. People were laughing, smiling, holding signs with familiar slogans. But he could tell that something had changed. The laughter came easier now. The need to push back had quieted. Not because people had stopped caring, but because they had stopped believing that loudness alone could fix what was broken. He stepped onto the stage and delivered his monologue without referencing the interview. He didn't need to. The moment had passed, but what it left behind had not. In a factory in Indiana, a foreman named Devin watched the same clip on his phone during a 15-minute break. He had dismissed the interview when it first aired, but now, weeks later, he watched the pause between the question and the answer. He watched it twice. When the break ended, he stood up and said nothing to the others in the break room. But something in his voice softened when he gave instructions. Something in his posture changed. Not because of politics, because he had seen a powerful man hesitate. And that hesitation had made space for his own. In early spring, a school in North Carolina hosted a community town hall in its gymnasium. The topic was not national politics. It was local industry. A manufacturer had shut down its regional branch, citing foreign competition and raw material costs. Most of the audience came from families who had worked there for generations. They spoke not with anger, but with weariness. When one man mentioned tariffs, there was no applause, only silence. A woman near the back stood to speak. Her voice was soft but steady. "I supported him because he said things no one else would say, but I lost my job anyway. And I've realized that strength isn't how loud you are. It's how long you stay when people need answers." No one challenged her. No one stood to debate. People just listened. In a high-rise apartment in New York, Donald Trump sat with a stack of memos he no longer read. The desk had been cleared by aides earlier that morning, but he had asked for the papers back. He liked the feeling of holding weight in his hands, even if it was no longer relevant. He flipped through each page without looking at the words. Then he stopped on a briefing from 2 months earlier, polling numbers, demographic summaries, notes from donors. There was a handwritten message in the margin. "They still want to believe, but they need more than defiance." He stared at the sentence. Then he folded the page and slid it into a drawer. He did not tear it. He did not speak. In Los Angeles, Jimmy Kimmel finished taping his segment and returned to his office. The studio was quiet. Most of the crew had gone home. On his desk were the 2 letters he had saved. One unsigned. One from a student in Kansas. He read them both again. He thought about what it meant to hold on to moments that didn't end cleanly. Moments that left you with more questions than answers. He had not set out to change anyone's mind. He had only wanted to tell the truth out loud. He folded the letters and placed them in an envelope marked Keep. Then he turned off the light and left the building with no security, no cameras, and no one asking him what came next. In Pennsylvania, Linda Novak walked the same road she had walked for years. It was quiet. The flagpole at the end of the street was still bare, but she no longer expected it to carry something for her. The truth she had found had not arrived all at once. It had come slowly, like dawn that filtered in through drawn curtains. She paused under a tree and looked at the pale sky above the rooftops. For a moment, she thought about the silence on that stage, about the pause between question and answer, and about how that pause had grown into something larger than any argument she had ever seen on television. It had become a mirror, not just for Donald Trump, but for everyone who had followed him, everyone who had waited for words that never came, everyone who had learned to live with noise so long that stillness felt unfamiliar. Now that stillness had arrived, not as punishment, not as defeat, but as an invitation to choose something quieter, to choose something truer. And across the country, more people were beginning to accept that invitation, not with speeches, not with headlines, but with small, private decisions that would never make the news. Because what they needed now was not to be told who to trust. What they needed was the strength to listen again, and this time, to hear themselves.